Hello, I'm Dr. Peter Rasor, author, pastor, and professor for more than 20 years. And on this podcast, we think about things from a Christian perspective. We talk about theology, philosophy, and apologetics. And today, I'm actually looking at a very complex or difficult topic. And so we're going to be going in kind of deep today. And I'm going to have quite a few, illustrations and all as I go through this discussion. The discussion is really about a proof, if you will, for God's existence, or a philosophical argument for God's existence. And it's in the category of what we call cosmological arguments for God's existence. And when we deal with cosmological arguments, what we're dealing with is taking some sort of observation from the existence of the universe or the world, and then deducing from that or inferring from it that God must exist. And so that's sort of the category that we're going to be looking at today. Now, this particular argument for God's existence that I actually have come to really like is quite different than the typical type of cosmological arguments. Within cosmological arguments, we typically talk about cause and effect. There's a lot of emphases and underlying assumptions in regard to cause and effect. And so the attraction for me in regard to this argument that we're going to look at is that we don't have to have cause and effect to show that God exists. And the reason why this is so important today is because when we get into a lot of the quantum mechanics and physics of contemporary times, in the 21st century, there's a lot of uncertainty as to how cause and effect are working or operating, or even if they are. And so this particular argument totally sets the cause and effect question aside. We don't have to rely upon cause and effect. And so this is probably one of the main reasons why I've found this particular argument for God's existence so attractive. And actually, I find it quite convincing. So let me give you an intro before we actually get into the nuts and bolts of the argument. There was a book that was published back in 2010, and it's entitled New Proofs for the Existence of God. The subtitle is Contributions of Contemporary Physics and Philosophy. And the author is a Catholic priest. His name is Robert Spitzer. He has a lot of videos on YouTube. He has his own website, so on and so forth. And so the argument that I'm presenting to you today isn't mine. I can't take credit for it, but is one that I really like. And the reason why I want to actually talk about this argument is my hope is that I can articulate it in such a way that it's a little bit easier to understand, because the book itself, which, I'll put up on the screen here, but, show it here to you here. I'll put up a slide here for you to look at. The book itself is actually philosophically rigorous, and it can get a little complex. And so for the average person to actually pick the book up and try to read it, it's going to be difficult if you don't have any training in philosophy, and so on and so forth, especially in the area of metaphysics. And so I'm going to attempt today to do something that seems to me to even be somewhat difficult, and that is to lay out what this argument is in a way that is easily understood, or at least the best way that we can understand it. And I hope I can accomplish that. I don't have a whole lot of confidence, but we're going to give it a shot. And so, without further ado, let's just go ahead and lay out the basic argument. If you're not familiar with philosophical arguments or basic arguments for God's existence in the area of apologetics, we typically have premises, and we number those premises, and then we have a conclusion. So I'm just going to give you the premises and the conclusion, and I'll explain how this works as we go along. So the first premise, the base for the basic argument is this: either all of reality is conditioned, or there is at least one unconditioned reality. That's premise one. Premise two is all of reality is not conditioned. Therefore, there is at least one unconditioned reality. Now, in philosophy, we like to use symbols. We call it symbolic logic. And so if we were to put this into symbols, which the symbols represent the argument, okay, or the premises and the statements in the premises. So if we were to do a symbolic logic representation, this is what it would look like. I'll put it on the screen for you again here. Premise 1, CR, and basically what that means or stands for is that either all reality is conditioned, okay, so conditioned reality, that's what CR stands for, or there is at least one UR, or unconditioned reality. Okay, then premise 2, all of reality is not conditioned. And so basically we're negating or saying that the opposite is true of CR, or that, in other words, all of reality is not conditioned. So not all of reality is conditioned. And, really you don't have to know logic and philosophy here to see what the conclusion is going to be, because if you only have two options, CR or UR, and you don't have CR, what's left over? Well, it's UR, okay? So that's ultimately what we're going to try to show. Now, in order to show that that conclusion is true, that there has to be one unconditioned reality, and of course the idea is that the unconditioned reality is God, we have to show that premise 1 and premise 2 are true, because if those are true, then the conclusion, which is labeled as number 3, has to logically follow that it's true. Okay? Now, before we go any further, obviously, when we laid out this argument, you're probably scratching your head wondering, what in the world does all this mean? What is conditioned reality? What is unconditioned reality? This seems really odd. Well, that's why we have to do some preliminary ideas here first, and that gives some definitions. So, what do we mean here by conditioned reality, or CR for short? And the author, Robert Spitzer, he defines conditioned reality this way. Quote, any reality, for example, individual, particle, field, wave, structure, spatial-temporal continuum, spatial-temporal position, physical laws, for example, like E equals mc squared, that is dependent upon another reality for its existence or occurrence. Okay, obviously that's a textbook definition, and we're up in the stratosphere now. Bring us down to earth here. Well, that's my point in doing this video. I want to try to do my best to explain it so it's easier to understand. So, what is conditioned reality in my own language, all right, to put it in my own words? Basically, conditioned reality is the idea that for anything that exists in the universe or of all reality, it's conditioned upon other things being in place so it can exist. So to provide an illustration to make this more concrete, think of example for like a cat. In order for a cat to exist, we would call this a conditioned reality. A cat is conditioned, in reality, because it has to rely upon other things to be in existence in order for it to exist. So, for example, a cat, right? For a cat to exist, there has to be molecules in existence. There has to be chemicals in existence. There has to be biological things in existence. There has to be atoms and subatomic particles. There has to be a physical world, right? So on and so forth. So, in other words, in order just for a cat to exist, there are these other elements that have to be in place. There even has to be the idea of hair, right? I mean, a cat has hair. There has to be an idea of ears and eyes and so forth and everything that makes those things up. So that's what we mean by conditioned reality. There has to be certain parameters or things in place, if you will, in order for something else to be in place. We can do this with just anything. We took cat as an example, but we could easily say, well, let's think about water. Well, in order for water to exist, we have to have 2 hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom, right? Yeah, so because that's what makes water. We also have to have those subatomic particles, protons and neutrons, within hydrogen and oxygen and so on and so forth, and electrons, everything else. And so water's a conditioned reality because it relies upon other factors to exist. All right. Here's the point where we can sort of appreciate getting rid of this whole idea of cause and effect that are in traditional cosmological arguments. See, in traditional cosmological arguments, you have to rely upon cause and effect. But in contemporary physics, especially in quantum mechanics and all, the whole idea of cause and effect is in question. There's a whole lot of question marks as to what's really going on. Some of you may be familiar, for example, with Schrodinger's cat, what's going on with that, or the electron slit experiment, so on and so forth, because it seems like, it acts like a wave, but other times it acts like a particle, so on and so forth. So there's all this question of what cause and effect is, and are we understanding it properly? All of this contemporary physics has brought these questions back up again. And so we can just really ignore all those and just say, metaphysically, that is, in reality, in order for something to exist, a conditioned reality, that's what we're talking about, other conditions have to be in place. All right? Use another example, just in case we haven't grasped it yet. I am a conditioned reality because I am dependent or conditioned upon other realities for my existence, namely, the most obvious, my mother and my father. And then, obviously, my ancestry going on from my mother. She had to have a mother and father. My father, he had to have a mother and father, so on and so forth. But also other realities, chemical, biological, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so really, conditioned reality or conditional reality is about dependency upon other realities for its existence, okay? Now, this should be distinguished from the idea of contingency, because there is another argument by Leibniz, he was a philosopher of the Enlightenment period, known as the contingency argument. Okay, there's a difference here between conditioned reality and contingency. In contingency, what we are saying is that a thing's existence is dependent upon another reality for existence, but also it could have existed differently. Okay, so contingency, there's a little nuance there. So we shouldn't equate conditioned reality with contingency. Those are two different things, all right? Conditional reality, then, is merely about a reality's existence being dependent upon another reality. Like my existence is dependent upon my mother and father's existence, other physical realities, so on and so forth, okay? It doesn't concern itself with the question of whether, like, my existence could have been otherwise or different, so on and so forth. We are looking at the way things are, all right? Not as they could have been or could be, and so on and so forth. All right, so that's what conditioned reality is. We only have one more term that we actually have to define to understand this argument, all right? And that is the term you are, which stands for unconditioned reality. Unconditioned reality, if we understand conditioned reality, sounds just like it's exactly what it sounds like, right? I mean, if we understand conditioned reality, we know what unconditioned reality. Unconditioned reality means that something doesn't rely upon something else for its existence. No other realities have to be there. It's not conditioned. It's unconditioned. It exists in and of itself. To give a rote definition, Robert Spitzer puts it this way in his book, quote, any reality that does not depend on any other reality of any kind for its existence, or occurrence. All right, let me repeat that. Any reality that does not depend on any other reality of any kind for its existence or occurrence. Now, this particular idea is probably a little bit difficult to grasp because, to be quite honest, there is no such thing as an unconditioned reality in most of our experience in this universe. Because everything that we know is actually conditional, and we're actually going to talk about that here in a few minutes. That's part of the argument. But if somehow we can just think for a minute, think of some sort of object or thing, if you will, that doesn't rely on anything, any other realities for their existence, for itself to exist. It just exists in and of itself. All right? That's what we mean. That's what we mean by unconditioned reality. All right, so now we're ready to look at the premises, all right? Premise 1 and premise 2, and see if we can end up with the conclusion, right? Because we have to make sure that premise 1 is true and premise 2 is true, and then logically it follows that the conclusion would be true. All right, so premise 1. Either all of reality is conditioned, or there is at least one unconditioned reality, or there is at least one unconditioned reality and this will exhaust all possibilities. All right, well, let me rephrase that. I got my words kind of mixed up there. Again, this is a difficult topic. Premise 1, either all of reality is conditioned, or there is at least one unconditioned reality. And this premise, and this is what I meant to say, exhausts all the possibilities. That's why we can say either all of reality is conditioned, or there is at least one unconditioned reality. Okay, because that exhausts all the possibilities. Either everything is conditional in the universe, in all of reality, or there is at least one that isn't. Now, there could be two, there could be three, could be four, but we just want to start with one. Okay? We cannot have everything in reality be conditional. Does that make sense? Think about it. All of reality can't be conditional. Does that make sense? Think about it. That would be, because how would you get everything into existence? If my existence is conditioned upon my mother and father's existence, my mother and father's existence is based upon their parents' existence, and their parents' existence based upon their parents, so on and so forth, and you go on and on and on and on and on and on, there is no way that actually I would ever exist, because my existence depends upon all other things that exist that have to depend upon other things that exist. So how in the world could I ever come into existence? I wouldn't. And so what we're seeing here is that not all of reality is actually conditioned reality. Another way to think of this is that we cannot have every reality be conditional while at the same time having one that is not. Okay? This would be a contradiction. So premise 1 seems plausibly true, right? So let's look at premise 2 then. All of reality is not conditioned. So why should we accept this to be true? Well, first, let's consider that all of reality is conditioned, and all of them are finite in their existence, all right? This is sort of moving us a little bit further than what we just did in the first premise. If it is so that all of reality is conditioned, and all of them are finite in their existence, what we mean by finite is that they're limited, okay? They're not eternal. They're spatial. They have space-time limitations. That's the idea that we're talking about here. If this is the case, or if this were the case, then no conditioned reality would ever come to exist. That's to say, we would have no realities or existence of anything. And the reason why is because they would all depend upon some reality to exist. We're thinking about finitude here. This is the thrust, okay? The reason why they wouldn't exist is because there must be only one condition that exists to give rise to all the other conditions. Or else these other conditions can't exist. There has to be a stopping point. That's basically what I was trying to get at in the first premise, to show that it was true. If you keep going on back and on back and on back and on back and on back, you basically are trying to attempt to have what we call an infinite regress. And if you have an infinite regress, you have nothing grounding the existence of everything. Okay? And so you can never get to existence. It will never exist. In the same way, if we think of everything being finite, being limited, you can't have existence, because how would it ever come into existence? Because it's finite. It's limited in its existence, just coming into existence. But if it's based upon another limited spatio-temporal time, then it would never come into existence, and then the next thing wouldn't come into existence. So you have this whole string of conditioned realities that could never come into existence because they all rely upon one another. Okay, well, maybe there is a sort of reply to the idea that you can't have an infinite regress of conditioned realities. Maybe all reality is conditioned, but they're all infinite. Okay? However, if we think about this, this is going to be a problem too. Okay? Now, the reason why is because there's still not going to be a fundamental condition or foundational condition to give rise to all of the conditional, let me rephrase that, infinite conditioned realities. In an infinite series of conditional realities, all right? We always have to put some concrete, examples here, right? Help us to think through this a little bit easier. Let's say that my ancestry goes back infinite through time. Never began, and it'll never end, all right? That's what we call an actual infinite of conditions. If that were the case, we have no foundational or fundamental condition that gives rise to all of these conditioned realities that are infinite. If there is no fundamental condition, then none of the realities can come into existence. So, the conclusion then must be that there is at least one unconditioned reality, because those were our only two choices, right? Put it back on the screen here for us. Either all of reality is conditioned, or there's at least one unconditioned reality. We saw through argumentation that not all of reality can be conditioned, rather finite or infinite. Therefore, there's at least one unconditioned reality. Now, at this point, a typical cosmological argument would say, and this conditioned reality is what, or unconditioned reality, is what we know as God. But if we're going to be honest, we can't really quite go that far yet. We can't come to that conclusion. There are a lot of other questions that must be raised before we can get close to that. For example, we have to understand the nature of this unconditioned reality. Just because there is a reality that exists in and of itself, and it doesn't depend upon anything else, no other factors or elements, anything for its existence, doesn't automatically mean that we have what we know as God, especially the God of the Bible. We don't know the characteristics of this God yet. We don't know if this God is going to be a tyrant, a dictator, unloving. We have nothing of this yet. And so that would be the next step, of which actually Robert Spitzer does in his book. He actually begins with the character or nature of this unconditioned reality as simple. Okay, simplicity. In another podcast, I may actually go on to explain that a little bit more and find some more characteristics as to this unconditioned reality. So at this point, though, what we can actually say is that this unconditioned reality would have to be at least infinite, okay, or it wouldn't exist. We already saw that with the idea of finite, right? If it's finite, it's going to be conditioned upon something. But since it's unconditioned, it's going to be infinite, all right? In addition to that, if we were to bring in some other elements, say like from the Kalam cosmological argument, it may be helpful to say things or conclude things like Because we know that the Big Bang theory, the classical Big Bang theory is true, we know that space, time, matter, and energy had to come into existence at a certain point. And if that's so, then this unconditioned reality is not only infinite, but it's also spaceless, timeless, and things like that. It's outside the world. It's not material, because there was a time in which all the physical universe came into existence. And a thing that is coming into existence can't exist before it comes into its existence, right? So there has to be something outside the physical universe in order for the physical universe to come into existence when it didn't exist before. You can't bring it yourself. The physical world, the physical universe can't bring itself into existence, because then you would have something physical that exists before anything physical exists, which is a contradiction, right? So if you didn't grasp this particular argument, two ideas here. Go back and rewatch this video. Or two, pick up Robert Spitzer's book, New Proofs for the Existence of God. It may be a challenging work, but if you're interested in this material, in this particular argument, metaphysical argument for God's existence, pick it up, slowly read it more than once, digest it, think about it, because I have found it very powerful. And one of the primary attractions of it is we can get rid of cause and effect. We don't have to have cause and effect anymore to argue philosophically or apologetically, if you will, for God's existence. We can set that all aside now. All we have to do is think about in the idea of conditioned realities. There just has to be something that's already in existence that supports or has to be in place for another reality to be in existence. All right? Well, I hope you enjoyed this. I know it was tough, complex material. But again, review it, get the book, and I hope to see you next time. And always remember, like and subscribe if you like what you see. I'll see you next time.